Hello, everyone. I'm Olympia. Thank you for being here with me in this wonderful place called Lights Out Library. And I have a great story to tell you. We have plenty of things to discuss. But before we do, I would like to thank you for your continuous support over a little more than 2 years. And I would like to tell you a bit about myself before embarking on our adventure. Some of you have asked whether I am an AI voice, and maybe some of you have just wondered, and this is understandable, given the abundance of AI content at the moment. So I thought I would address that directly. I really am a real person. As a child, I lived in California, and during my teen years, I lived abroad with my family. I returned to the U.S. as an adult, first living in the Midwest and now in Texas. This might explain why some of my pronunciations are unfamiliar to some of you, or sound foreign. I became interested in this type of content years ago, following the French Whisperer, who is the author of these stories you listen to. We teamed up to create Lights Out Library in 2023. Since then, it has been a journey for me, learning how to speak in front of a microphone, record and polish the sound of the episodes. We are still looking for ways to improve the podcast, so your feedback is always welcome. And rest assured that Lights Out Library is entirely scripted and recorded by two humans. We don't use AI in the process. But now, before we begin, if you wish to, you may close your eyes and allow yourself to forget about any worries. Assume a comfortable position. Maybe move a bit to settle. Take a long, deep, relaxing breath. And when you slowly exhale, feel your shoulders drop. Release the tension in your neck. Let your face soften and your jaw relax. Make sure your fingers are not clenched and that your legs are relaxed too. And allow the sound of my voice to guide you through this journey. And now, off we go. What comes to mind when we hear about gold is its shine, its rarity, and what it symbolizes. Gold is the symbol of wealth and power. Beyond its appearance, the primary reason for gold's high value has always been its rarity. But how rare is gold exactly? If we consider the earth as a whole, it is probably far less rare than one might imagine. Gold is a heavy element, and during the formation of our planet, it tended to sink toward the Earth's core, along with other metals. Of course, gold is still rare in the planet's core compared to other metals such as iron, but geologists estimate that around 99% of Earth's gold resides in the core, making it completely inaccessible. This would be several billions of metric tons of gold deep inside the planet. But between us and that gold, there are hundreds of miles of crust and mantle that are impossible to mine. The gold humankind has access to is the small portion that remained near the surface in the Earth's crust. The concentration of gold is extremely small, 4 parts per billion. Said differently, it means that on average, in order to find 1 ounce of gold, that's about 28 grams, you need almost 8,000 tons of earth soil. That's like a small cargo ship worth of earth to find 1 ounce. And that makes the mining of gold only valuable in places where it is more concentrated. This means that any vein considered economically viable to exploit must contain at least about 0.5 parts per million of gold. That is hundreds of times more than the average concentration in the Earth's crust. Based on these estimates, there would be about 400 million metric tons of gold in the Earth's crust, but most of it in concentrations that are too low or buried too deep to be collected. And that's why, out of these 400 million tons, humanity has mined and retrieved a very small fraction, not even 1 million tons. The United States Geological Survey estimates that throughout human history, around 200,000 metric tons have been mined. That's not even 0.1% of the gold in the crust. And however ancient gold mining is, about 2/3 of this gold has been mined since 1950. 2/3. Which is telling about the efficiency of modern mining techniques and the size of gold mining operations since the 20th century. So, what has all this gold become? Of those 200,000 tons, about half exist in the form of jewelry. Around 1/3 is held as investment bars and coins, much of which is stored in the reserves of the central banks. The largest in the world has more than 8,000 metric tons, the U.S. gold reserves. They are stored primarily at the United States Bullion Depository in Kentucky, better known as Fort Knox. Other large national reserves of gold, about 2,000 or 3,000 metric tons, are found in Germany, China, Italy, Russia, and France. These are mind-boggling quantities of gold, but relative to all the gold that exists in the world, they are not as large as one might expect. I mentioned before that the U.S. reserves were at 8,000 tons out of 200,000 tons mined in history. That's only about 4 or 6% of everything, all the gold that was mined since 1950. So the reality is that gold ownership is scattered around the world, and many individuals own some, even if it's just a ring, a piece of jewelry, or even some gold leaf on something. Or, and that's the third use of gold that accounts for about 10% of the world's stock. Gold is used in electronic devices, in many of them, including computers and smartphones that use a tiny bit of gold in their components. But what makes gold so attractive and valuable? In order to understand it, we need to start exploring its history and some of its characteristics. And this means going back thousands of years into the past, at the very beginnings of metallurgy. Gold may be rare, but it was probably the first metal used by humans because, unlike most others, it can be found free or native in nature, pure in its metallic form and not chemically bound to other elements. This is no coincidence. It has everything to do with gold's chemical properties. Unlike silver, for example, its shine does not fade. Gold does not rust because it does not react easily with other elements, especially oxygen, to form oxides. For this reason, although rare, nuggets of pure gold could sometimes be found close to the surface or in riverbeds. The shine likely attracted human attention early on, and because gold is malleable and relatively easy to melt, its melting point is around 1100 degrees Celsius, far lower than iron's 1500. It could be used to create artifacts very early in human history. The oldest gold objects that are well dated and that we know of are from the 5th millennium BC, and they were found in Bulgaria. That's centuries before the appearance of the first urban civilizations in the Middle East or in the Indus Valley. And it is even older than the oldest known large monuments, such as the Egyptian pyramids or Stonehenge. About at the same time, it is believed gold artifacts also circulated in Egypt in this very early period, called pre-dynastic in Egyptian history, and a little bit later in Mesopotamia too. Silver seems to have been discovered a bit later than gold, around 4000 BC, probably because it requires extraction from ores. Like gold, it is rather malleable and could be shaped without advanced tools. Stone tools could be sufficient. So these two metals were uncommon, which made them desirable. Their shine was attractive, especially gold. Silver may darken, but its shine can be restored by rubbing it a little bit, so it was also aesthetically appealing. The two metals could also be worked, and these initial characteristics probably established their value, their appeal. And this probably explains why ancient cultures gave them a special status, but with important differences. In ancient Egypt, gold became more than a metal. It was perceived from the early period of civilization along the Nile as a kind of divine substance and a symbol of eternity, of power and wealth. The very first artifacts made with gold, found in tombs, that include beads and ornaments like bracelets, date from 4500 BC. That is to say, this pre-dynastic period before Egypt was unified, and as its culture was still in its formation phase. By the Old Kingdom, in the 3rd millennium BC, gold mining in Egypt had become a state-organized activity, employing hundreds, and in some cases thousands of workers at specific mining sites. Gold was rather abundant in Egypt, in its eastern desert, and even more to the south in Nubia, which corresponds to the north of Sudan today. In Nubia, there were mines and also deposits in riverbeds. This abundance of gold in Nubia was the main reason why, along the history of Egypt, the The control of this region, either with close commercial ties or direct occupation, was always a concern of the pharaohs, and much of the gold that ended up in the temples or in the tombs of ancient Egyptians came from Nubia. We know that gold in ancient Egypt was applied to all symbols of power: crowns, scepters, pectorals, the cobra that pharaohs had on their crowns. All of this was made of or covered in gold. Gold also had practical uses, particularly for highly luxurious objects such as plates or cups, reserved for a tiny elite and for special occasions. Gold powder could be occasionally used as makeup, as an ornament. Gold was also used in architecture and decoration. One of its earliest architectural applications was gold leaf applied to obelisks, tall, slender monuments topped with a small pyramid. This top could be covered in gold leaf or in electrum, an alloy of gold and silver, to make it shiny. The doors of temples and their interiors could be covered in gold leaf too, and the effect was probably striking when sunlight entered or when they reflected the flames of torches and braziers. And finally, the most famous use of gold was for funerary practices. Gold was central to burial rituals of the wealthy and powerful, and it was used in large quantities. The best documented examples of this that we know of is the tomb of Tutankhamun, discovered almost untouched in the 1920s. Tutankhamun was not even an important pharaoh. He died young and probably almost powerless in the hands of ministers and priests. And yet, there were hundreds of gold ornaments in his tomb. And on his mummy, just his mask weighed 10 kilograms. That's about 20 pounds of pure gold. This tells us of the quantity of gold the Egyptians had access to, but also of the symbolic value they attached to it, beyond its monetary value. As a result, the supply of gold remained a constant concern throughout Egyptian history. One clear indication of this is that the Egyptians produced some of the earliest geological maps we know of. The Turin Papyrus map, dating to the end of the New Kingdom in the late 2nd millennium BC, depicts the eastern desert of Egypt, showing its gold mines, quarries, and even workers' settlements. The importance of gold in ancient Egypt, combined with the extraordinary longevity of its civilization, had a profound influence on the Greeks and later the Romans. To them, Egypt was the land of the gold, a place whose reputation for wealth and magnificence endured long after it had declined as a great power. Now, one use of gold or silver that we may think of, but was not developed in Egypt, was coinage minting, the use of metals, including of lesser value like copper or bronze, to mint coins. Actually, the first gold coins we know of around the world appeared only in the 1st millennium BC, after the decline of Egypt, and it is believed the first kingdom to introduce standardized coins was Lydia, an ancient kingdom in Anatolia, modern Turkey. By the 1st millennium BC, Metals were already used for transactions, but there were no coins. For large purchases, large transactions, metal ingots were transported, especially of silver, which was more common and less expensive than gold. Metal ingots in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East had standardized shapes and weights, and it is believed that they were recognized as a kind of currency, but only for very large transactions or payment of tributes, because obviously one ingot of silver had an important value. This could not be used for small transactions between individuals at the time. A lot of state gifts or tributes were paid, expressed in silver or copper. But in the late Bronze Age, coins were introduced. So it started in Lydia, but in a few centuries the practice spread to the Old World, from China to the Mediterranean. Coins were a way to pay for transactions of a smaller size. They introduced a currency that was more usable. Now, a bigger difference with the modern coins or bank notes is that today we attribute value to these means of payment, not because they are made of precious material. We know they have worth because they can be used to pay for goods and services. They will be accepted, and their value derives from their daily use in the economy and the fact that they are official and issued by a single legitimate legal institution, a central bank. There is a government and an entire economy behind them. So, in other words, the value of these means of payment is based on trust in institutions and on the anticipated acceptance of them when we want to buy something in the economy. There was nothing like that in antiquity. No way of controlling that coins could only be issued by a single institution, because anyone could have replicated them. So the value of coins in antiquity was defined by and limited to the value of the metal they were made of. They had to be made of gold, silver, or lesser metals such as copper and bronze. And this is what determined their purchasing power and their acceptance. But that's something important for precious metals, because it is the moment when they start to evolve from ornaments, decorations, symbols of status, or religious sacred symbols to also become means of payment. Of course, they already had value for exchanges. They were traded before, and they could serve as tributes. But with the introduction of standardized ingots and later coins, their role in facilitating trade became much more important. States understood this especially well in the first millennium BC, a period when long-distance trade between different parts of the world began to take off. The Silk Road opened during this time, linking China to the Mediterranean and reshaping economies, cultures, and ideas along its entire length. India traded with the Persian Empire and China. The Phoenicians and the Greeks acted as go-betweens, intermediaries around the Mediterranean, developing international trade. So it is logical that coinage and this amplified role assigned to gold and silver appeared at the time. The oldest coin factory that produced bronze coins was excavated in China. It dates from the 7th and 6th centuries BC in the province of Hunan in central China. But for trade to run smoothly, it was necessary to standardize the means of payment, and that was a problem with these early coins from Lydia. They were made of electrum, this gold and silver alloy, but the percentage of each metal was not consistent between different batches of coins, so their value was uncertain, and it hampered their development. The first gold coins with standardized weight and purity were issued under King Croesus, the king of Lydia, in the 6th century BC. This gave people trust in the quality and quantity of gold in each coin. These coins were very convenient for merchants and governments, and this standardization inspired the Greeks and the Persians, the Achaemenid Empire, to do the same and create theirs. In Greek historiography, Croesus became associated with great wealth because, on top of having a prosperous kingdom, he had access to important gold deposits in Anatolia, especially in a river, the Pactolus, which contained a lot of natural electrum, significantly more than what the Greeks had. It didn't save Lydia, though, because it ended up conquered and annexed by the Persian Empire. After his conquest of Lydia and victory over Croesus, the Persian Emperor Cyrus the Great introduced the first coins to his empire, replicating what was done in Lydia. And that was important because the Achaemenid Empire was by far the largest state on earth at the time. It was at a meeting point between China, India, and the Mediterranean, the more advanced parts of the world back then, and this contributed to a further spread of the use of gold and silver coins. There would be a lot to say about the history of coinage, obviously, and that could be a topic of its own. But we should bear in mind that for a very long time, from the first millennium BC until almost modern times, before the rise of paper money and international banking, gold and silver served as the main means of payment and the principal standards of international trade. This increase in long-distance trade made gold, in particular, incredibly valuable and strategically important throughout much of human history. For a long time, coins and banknotes issued by central banks had a value based on the right to convert them into a given quantity of gold or silver, something that has disappeared today since the 19th and 20th centuries. Gold has retained its status as the precious metal of reference. It has remained very valuable, but it has lost this function as currency for trade it had centuries ago. Its function as counterpart to coins and banknotes. They are no longer exchangeable or convertible at the central bank. So nowadays, central banks retain gold reserves essentially as a way of diversifying their monetary reserves. It is a reserve of value, one of the things that guarantee their financial strength, that they are solid institutions, and that the currency they issue is worth using because, among other things, they have a few hundreds or thousands of tons of gold in a safe that could be used. Now, in antiquity, apart from Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in Phoenician cities, in Greece, in the Roman Empire, or in Persia. Gold was also used in jewelry and as ornamentation, probably not as predominantly as in Egypt, but it was still the metal of choice for royal ornaments in temples. The most precious Greek statues, for example, were covered in gold leaf or made with ivory and gold, such as the statue of Zeus at Olympia, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. This type of statue, which was made of wood and covered with plaques of gold and ivory, was called chryselephantine, literally of gold and ivory. Access to gold could vary dramatically from one part of the world to another. A striking example of this contrast in medieval times is the difference between Europe and the Americas before European contact, or Africa. In medieval Africa, the most powerful state was probably the Mali Empire in Western Africa, which had access to large gold deposits that it traded with the Islamic world in North Africa and the Middle East. In the Americas, whether in Mesoamerica or in the Andes to the south, gold was far more abundant and accessible than it was in Europe. In all these places, gold was precious and had this special status due to its appearance and relative rarity, but nowhere as much as in Europe, which was starved of precious metals at the time, starved of gold and to a lesser extent of silver. Why was that? Because first, Europe did not have large and rich mines. There were some in Spain or in Austria, but they were not that productive. And second, because structurally, Europe lost its gold. It was a buyer of foreign products, especially spices, and also silk and other fabrics, ivory, gems, and that came from Africa or along the Silk Road and the Spice Road via the Middle East, and trade hubs like Alexandria or Constantinople. Europe had a few things to sell, but nothing as valuable or in high demand, and so structurally it was buying more than it was selling. This meant the difference had to be paid somehow, and somehow meant in gold and silver. So this drained Europe of its precious metals, and as a result, medieval Europe was probably the one region of the world with the least stock of gold, which also meant that the value of gold was very high as a result of its scarcity. And that contributed to turning gold into the ultimate symbol of wealth for Europeans of the Middle Ages. And the early modern era, too. When they came into contact with pre-Columbian cultures of the Americas, where gold was appreciated but not the object of the same craze, the pre-Columbians could just not understand that the conquistadors were so greedy for gold, and the thirst for gold they were showing. It made no sense to them. The one region where gold was not sought after was North America, among most Native American peoples. They just saw no value in gold because, even though it was pretty, it was also useless, not strong enough to make any tool or weapon with it, so they never bothered to collect it. There was so much more value in materials that combined a particular appearance and a utility, like obsidian, for example, which is not that common, and that they would have chosen over gold without hesitation. And this example of pre-Columbian North America, north of Mexico, reminds us that the value of gold is something totally cultural. It is useless. We may find it beautiful and shiny. There is probably something of this beauty that is spontaneously appealing to humans beyond particular cultures. Maybe because it reminds us of the sun. But still, gold has value only because of its aesthetic appeal and rarity, but it is not something necessary. It is not something useful at all, except nowadays in a few electronics applications. But still, that's not a vital kind of material, so its value is purely based on its desirability as a reserve of value or as a symbol of wealth. Does it mean that its value could drop one day? Theoretically, yes. But what makes gold a solid reserve of value is the weight of time and its appeal across multiple cultures. An appeal that may not be as universal as we just saw, but still very widespread across time and space. After thousands of years of high valuation, after gold has been associated with symbols of power in crowns, and scepters, and religious ornaments, the high value of gold is very well installed in culture, and it is constantly reinforced because it is visible as a symbol of wealth. And this is what gives it value rather than its rarity. There are plenty of things that are rare but not valuable. There is an apparently absurd enigma that goes like this: what is rare is expensive, but a cheap car is rare. Therefore, a cheap car must be expensive. The conclusion sounds absurd, but only because the initial proposition that rarity alone makes something expensive is simply false. Plenty of books were printed at only a handful of copies. Doesn't make them very valuable. Eggs with 3 yolks are extremely rare. 1 out of 25 million eggs. But it doesn't necessarily mean you would pay to have one. It's not worth it. Rarity is a condition of high value, yes, but not the one determining factor. It needs to be paired with something that makes the thing desirable. But the cultural value of gold is unique. It has the perfect mix of desirability for its appearance, rarity, and cultural appreciation. And that's why its value is so well established. The proof of this is how resilient it has been to the rise in the stock of gold. I mentioned at the beginning that 2/3 of the gold in circulation around the world had been mined since 1950. So, in other words, the quantity of gold in circulation in the world has tripled in less than a century. And yet its value has remained very high. If we think in terms of current currency, gold even appears to have skyrocketed in value. In 1950, for example, 1 ounce of gold was priced at 35 US dollars. Today, it trades above $3,000, but that figure is expressed in nominal, not inflation-adjusted terms. If we take into account inflation, which has also diluted the purchasing power of $1, its value has gone through large moves, but overall it has retained its purchasing power. So, over this long period, gold has been a good hedge, a good reserve of value. In order to make people really lose interest in gold and see its value fall, it would take either the discovery of huge deposits or the emergence of another, more attractive reserve of value that would make many people try to switch to something else. Or, in the very long term, there could be a cultural shift that would make the accumulation of something material, a physical quantity of gold, undesirable. None of this seems to be about to happen, so the value of gold still looks good. Now returning to pre-Columbian America, for cultures in Mesoamerica and South America, gold was still appreciated and sought after. The Aztecs regarded it as the product of the gods, a substance that would have arrived on Earth directly from the divine dimension. In South America, the Incas also had large quantities of gold mined in the Andes in Peru and Bolivia, and Colombia was another place where gold was abundant. You have heard of this myth of El Dorado, the supposed city or land hidden somewhere in the Americas that would have been made entirely of gold. This myth emerged in the years following the Spanish conquest of Mexico and their first expeditions to South America. This name, El Dorado, is derived from the name given by the first Spanish explorers when they saw a ceremony of a people called the Muiscas. In what is now modern Colombia, the king of the Muiscas would cover himself in gold, in a gold powder, before walking into a lake to wash the gold off as an offering to the gods, whereas at the same time his followers threw golden objects into the lake. They call this king, or the ritual, El Rey Dorado, El Dorado, the Golden One. And as the rumor spread in Spanish colonies and then in Europe, El Dorado became a place. Of course, it was never found, even though various expeditions searched for it in the 16th and 17th centuries. But the Spanish did find a lot of gold in America, and their insatiable greed at the time is also the consequence of this particular status that gold had acquired in medieval Europe as the ultimate symbol of wealth. In that respect, the conquest of Mexico and the quantity of gold seized there and sent to Spain was a huge success that was repeated in South America with the Incas, or to a lesser extent in Colombia with the Muiscas. And the huge quantity of gold and silver that arrived in Spain in the 16th century, first the loot and then the product of mines, was also a game changer for Europe as a whole. From the place where gold was the scarcest in the world, Europe became the place where there was the biggest quantity. At the same time, the historical drain on European gold and silver due to trade with the rest of the world. What I mentioned before, this disappeared because from the 16th century, European merchants were now taking control of oceanic trade, spices, silk, gems, and soon colonial crops like sugar, cotton, tobacco, dyes. First the Portuguese and then the Dutch, the English, the French. They took control of this trade, and after that came the Industrial Revolution. As a result of these changes, it was now Europe that sold more than it bought. All of this reversed gold flows and made Europe very gold rich by the 18th and 19th centuries. All through these periods, another aspect of the appeal of gold, and one that lasted well into the 18th century, was this ancient discipline called alchemy. Alchemy was a broad tradition that existed since antiquity, from China to Europe, including the Islamic world or India. There were different approaches to it, different schools and different understandings of what it was about. But their common thread is that alchemy was about the alteration, the transformation of certain materials into other materials. A common aim of alchemists was a transformation of what they called base metals, like lead, into noble metals, like gold. This is not the only thing alchemy was about. Other frequent goals included the creation of an elixir of immortality, or the creation of treatments called panaceas, treatments that could cure any disease. But the transformation, the transmutation of low-valued metals into gold, was often the main topic of experimentation by alchemists. Of course, they could not succeed because gold is not the product of chemical reactions between molecules like other substances can be. It is an element, and in order to turn an element into another, one would have to change its atomic structure, the number of protons inside its nucleus. This is something that requires mobilizing equipment and a quantity of energy that were completely out of reach of alchemists. But even though alchemy was never scientific, it was still a practice that led to experimentation and questioning about what matter was. It was also the alchemists of the Middle Ages who developed some of the first laboratory techniques. For this reason, alchemy still played a role in the emergence of modern science, particularly chemistry and medicine, not so much as a producer of knowledge, but as a tradition of questioning, experimentation, and investigative methods. Yet it is revealing that an entire esoteric tradition took the creation of gold as one of its central goals. This alone shows how difficult it is to regard gold as merely one element among others. Its symbolic and cultural charge is so powerful that it resists being thought of as just another chemical element. The enduring appeal of gold and its influence on history was once again demonstrated in the 19th century with the proliferation of gold rushes around the world. The gold rush is a sudden discovery of gold, and that brings an onrush of miners or aspiring miners, sometimes from the other side of the world. We may think of the largest gold rushes to the U.S., like to California or Alaska or to Canada, the Klondike Gold Rush, also to South Africa or Australia. But there were many more, including in these same countries, and also to South America, to the Caribbean, or to New Zealand. The 19th century was a time of many of these, due to accelerated geological exploration and the development of transportation, and also information traveling faster than ever before with steamships or the telegraph. A gold rush typically began with the discovery of what is known as placer gold, that is to say, gold deposits found in stream beds. These beds were sometimes dry, which was actually more convenient for mining than working in flowing water. Gold was found there because erosion had carried it away from a vein and deposited it in the stream bed. These deposits could be recovered with very simple equipment, sometimes even by a single person, filtering sediment or digging just below the surface. A few fortunes were built like this by individuals lucky enough to strike gold and exploit it discreetly, or buying the land and move to a bigger operation. What made this kind of prospection so attractive to recent immigrants and Europeans, especially poor Europeans, was that with no experience and minimal equipment offered the hope of sudden fortune. So even in remote locations, all streams and many rock formations were searched for nuggets. Once discovered, however, these spots were quickly worked and depleted. They often pointed to the presence of large gold deposits upstream, either in the original vein or in deeper deposits underground. And that was when the need to move on to larger equipment and many more people, it made it impossible to hide the discovery. The news could spread quickly, and hundreds or thousands of aspiring miners could rush to the place in the hope of finding a piece of land to exploit or another spot nearby. This pattern repeated itself many times in America, and not just in the West. The very first gold rush in the U.S. was in 1799 in North Carolina, east of Charlotte. Then there was one in 1829 in the southern Appalachians, the Georgia Gold Rush. And after that came the most famous, from 1848 to 1855, California Gold Rush, which not only became famous worldwide, but also set a blueprint for gold rushes. Other than aspiring miners, some people understood that money could be made not only in the prospection and mining, but also around them: infrastructure, retail, construction, machinery, and engineering. Even though these rushes were most of the time rather short-lived, they left traces and helped create infrastructures, roads, even railroads, ports. They helped develop entire industries and create towns, some of which later found ways to sustain themselves and reinvent their economies after the boom. This was the case with San Francisco, for example. The city boomed during the California Gold Rush, growing from a small settlement into a major commercial and transportation hub. When the rush ended, San Francisco suffered, but it survived, diversified its economy, and went on to grow far larger. Other American rushes include many smaller ones in the Rocky Mountains in Colorado, Idaho, Montana. For a time, the Northwest and northwestern Canada were also heavily prospected until attention turned to Alaska, with several more rushes there in the 1890s. The last of the great gold rushes in North America was in Canada, the Klondike Gold Rush in the Yukon Territory. That's the Canadian territory that touches Alaska to the northwest. The Klondike is a river in which, in 1896, local miners found gold. The news reached Seattle and San Francisco the following year. In 1897, triggering a huge gold rush that included an estimated 100,000 prospectors. A few became wealthy. The first ones to arrive were the lucky ones, and the vast majority went in vain. The most motivated moved soon after to other spots in Alaska to keep searching. Out of North America, another major rush was in South Africa, and that would become a big deal because in the 20th century, South Africa became a huge gold producer with its mines. For a significant part, this dramatic increase in the quantity of gold extracted worldwide, as I mentioned, the stock had tripled since 1950 and even quadrupled since 1900. This is due for a large part to the exploitation of South African mines. This big South African rush in the 1880s led to the founding of Johannesburg. To illustrate how big that was, in 1886, South Africa did not produce gold, or not significantly. In 1896, 10 years later, it accounted for 23% of the world's output. Another thing these rushes accelerated in the late 19th century and the early 20th century was the use of new extraction methods. For example, in South Africa, potassium cyanide was used to extract gold from low-grade ore. Many new techniques like these, from the use of chemicals to the use of pressurized water to dig veins or rocks with low concentrations of gold, have been implemented and have made viable the exploitation of deposits that would not have been practical or made sense financially before. And there were more of these rushes around the world. To conclude on that, they also played a role in the development and migration to Australia, especially the biggest ones, the New South Wales and Victorian gold rushes in 1851. And again in the 1890s, the Western Australian gold rush. In Australia, as in South Africa and United States, many arrived as would-be prospectors, but found little success in their search for gold. Yet because land was available, or because settlement was actively encouraged, many stayed on and eventually became farmers. That move was often chaotic and violent because law enforcement was minimal, and force, rather than right or fairness, determined who got what. And the natives, when there were some living near the places where the rushes happened, were always the losers, with traumatic consequences for them. This peak period of gold rushes is the second half of the 19th century, but even though these past migrations belong to history, it would be a mistake to think the era of individual miners hoping to strike gold has ended. Indeed, it never did. It just became much less visible. There are an estimated 10 to 30 million small-scale miners today, far more than at the time of the California or the Klondike Rush. They prospect, not just for gold. Diamonds and other gems are also important. millions of them are in Africa and to a lesser extent in Asia and South America. Just for Africa, it is estimated that billions of dollars in gold are smuggled out of the continent each year. For a large part, gold mined by these small independent miners, wherever they can, is often out of any legal frame, and this gold transits through the Middle East, like the Emirates, and from there it is reinjected into the world market. So we cannot call that rushes anymore, but with the families and the local spending of the revenues generated by this activity, tens of millions around the world depend partially or entirely on that type of mining for their livelihood. And as I mentioned, they do not mine only gold. There is silver. There are gemstones. But apart from this, there are other precious metals too. So let's take a look at this. So, what constitutes a precious metal? The definition of it is more economic and cultural than scientific. Precious metals are rare and have a high economic value due to a sustained demand for them coming from their use. For example, in industrial processes, or from their desirability as stores of value and use in jewelry making. They are also shiny. This is part of their appeal. There are elements that are rare, rarer than gold, and more expensive than it, too. For example, plutonium is. Its natural concentration in the Earth's crust is 4,000 times smaller than gold. And even though it is not directly comparable because there is not an open market for plutonium, the production cost of 1 gram of weapon-grade plutonium is estimated to be about 50 times the current price of 1 gram of gold. Plutonium is also a metal, and although it could be considered precious in the sense that it is rare and expensive, this is not what we mean by a precious metal. Precious metals must also be pretty and widely recognized as a store of value, often, as we have seen, even in the form of jewelry. This is why the list of precious metals include generally coinage metals, gold, silver, and also copper. Even though it is much less expensive, for comparison, copper is traded by the pound mostly. It is worth 4 to 5 US dollars per pound, around 30 cents per ounce. So 30 cents for 1 ounce of copper versus more than 3,000 for the same mass of gold. That's 10,000 times more expensive. To these coinage metals, we can add the platinum group metals, which are noble metals in the chemical sense. This means they are weakly reactive. They do not readily bind with other elements. As a result, they are chemically stable and highly resistant to corrosion, oxidation, and tarnishing, all of which are consequences of chemical reactions. In this platinum group, we have metals that can also serve in jewelry and be more expensive than gold. Ruthenium, rhodium, osmium, iridium, and platinum. The last one is the most widely traded of them. And again, for comparison, 1 ounce at the moment is worth around $2,200 versus $4,400 for gold. But some metals are even more expensive. Rhodium, for example, which can trade for several $1,000s per ounce. It is unclear exactly when mankind started using platinum. Some has been found in the Egyptian artifacts of the late period, the first millennium BC, but it isn't clear whether or not the Egyptians had identified it as a different metal because it was associated with gold, and maybe they confused the two. Also, from the first millennium BC, there are a few examples of platinum artifacts made by a South American culture of Ecuador, the culture of La Tolita. In any case, platinum flew under the radar for most cultures around the world until the 18th century, when it was finally isolated, identified as a whitish, shiny metal that for a time was called white gold. And from the 18th century, platinum has started its slow installation into the group of precious metals because it was found to be pretty, shiny, and rare. But this is still recent compared with the thousands of years of gold, and that's why, even though platinum is well known by the general public and recognized as precious, it doesn't have the aura of gold. I mentioned rhodium, and it is one of the most expensive metals, and because it is a noble metal, it doesn't react much. That's why it's often found either in its pure form or mixed with other metals from the same group. They work well together chemically. Rhodium was discovered in 1803, and its high price come from its crucial use as a catalyst, an element that favors chemical reactions, especially in catalytic converters in cars. It is also used in jewelry to plate white gold with a thin layer of rhodium to improve its appearance. White gold is an alloy. It is not another metal. An alloy of gold with at least one other metal, usually nickel or palladium, sometimes a bit of copper to increase its malleability. Still, the common white gold formulation in jewelry contains 90% gold, so it is rather pure. But in appearance, it will look more silvery than the yellow of natural gold. Another factor behind rhodium's high price is its extreme rarity. About 0.2 parts per billion in Earth's crust. By comparison, gold occurs at around 4 parts per billion, making rhodium around 20 times less abundant. To put this into perspective, extracting a single ounce of gold requires processing roughly a small cargo ship's worth of earth. For rhodium, that same ounce would require something closer to a supertanker's worth of soil. So, between the rarity and the industrial demand and its use in small quantities in jewelry, you have the elements that command this high price of rhodium. Among naturally occurring precious metals, rhodium is the most expensive. But just for the record, it is not the most expensive of all metals. If we include synthetic ones, the ones that do not exist naturally and have to be synthesized. As of January 2026, there is californium, a synthetic and radioactive metal which is only produced synthetically and in very small quantities, 30 to 40 micrograms per year. At this rate, it would take thousands of years to produce 1 gram of it. But still, if we extrapolate the cost of californium, it would be worth around $27 million per gram. A very theoretical gram, given that such a quantity has never been synthesized. But still, if one metal deserved the adjective precious, it would have to be this one. Tonight, we're going to follow the long journey of one of humanity's oldest inventions, ceramics. Born more than 25,000 years ago, pottery has been shaping our daily lives ever since. It may sound ancient, even ordinary, but ceramics are anything but obsolete. From the plates on our tables and the tiles beneath our feet, to the bricks that build our cities, ceramics are everywhere. And even as you listen to this story, ceramics are at work inside the very device you're using, hidden in the technology of modern electronics. So, how do we create and reproduce all these objects? It all begins with the first one, the original, which is sculpted and polished by hand with clay. And once it is ready, its shape, its print, is taken in plaster. The matrix is made with plaster. It is like a negative version of the item. The matrix serves as a model for mold casts that will be used to make many more. Typically, these molds can be opened with a small opening at the top through which the clay is poured. The material used must be liquid enough to flow into every detail of the mold. So the clay is mixed with water until it reaches a consistency similar to melted chocolate or heavy cream. Over the course of a few hours, the raw material begins to set. The water does not simply evaporate through the small opening. Instead, it is mostly absorbed by the plaster of the mold. When the mold is opened, the piece has taken shape, but it is still very soft and fragile. It then needs to be left to dry for several days. Flat objects, such as plates or ashtrays, can be molded in a single piece. But for hollow containers like vases, the form is usually made in two parts, which are then carefully assembled while the clay is still wet and pliable. Now, these plaster molds can be used a few dozen times only, and they need to be remade regularly because they get damaged a little bit every time they serve, especially for pieces with more intricate detail. They absorb water each time and have to dry between uses. And because they are made of plaster, they dissolve a little bit before pieces are fully dry. There may be bits that need to be removed, and a few days later, when they are almost ready, they are polished to look impeccable before the next step, which is going to be painting, applying a glaze. The glaze, or the coating of the ceramic, has to be applied evenly on the pieces. And this is obviously not regular paint. We'll talk about the coatings of ceramic, why they are very useful, and also the art that appeared around it long ago. Once the glaze has been applied, the time for transformation has come. The miracle of firing. Items are placed in large ovens. They're called kilns. One can accommodate dozens of pieces in them depending on their size. They are now mostly commonly electric, and the temperature inside rises in excess of 1,000 degrees Celsius for several hours. For comparison, a kitchen oven can heat up to about 300 degrees Celsius, maybe a bit more. But this is 3 times more. And the temperature reached inside these kilns would make many metals melt. Lead, for example, melts at just 330 degrees, zinc at 420. So this is seriously hot. The firing is essentially about transforming the piece thanks to chemical reactions. They become stronger, waterproof thanks to their coating, and the layer of paint also turns shiny. The pieces are then ready with their new properties, including a remarkable stability. Organic matter like wood may decay, metals can rust, but ceramics stay exactly the same. They are somewhat fragile, but otherwise, they will look like new in centuries. The process has been perfected over several millennia. There are variants to it. There are also different types of ceramics that we will talk about. But these bases were laid long before metallurgy appeared. They spread or were invented in multiple places around the world. And this is exactly the long story we are going to explore tonight. But before we begin, a quick note. We have a Patreon page for those of you who wish and are able to support this project, enjoy extra content, and listen ad-free on your favorite podcast app. Patreon lets you support our work directly with plans starting at $3.50 a month, though you can give whatever you like. And everyone gets access to everything on our page, because the world is a better place when the sun shines for everyone. Patrons can download and listen to all episodes with and without background sounds and have early access to new releases. We have added links to Patreon in the description of the episode. And now, let's take a moment to forget about our worries. If you wish to, you may close your eyes and immerse yourself in the story. Assume a comfortable position. Maybe move a bit to settle. Take a long, deep, relaxing breath. And when you slowly exhale, feel your shoulders drop. Release the tension in your neck. Let your face soften and your jaw relax. Make sure your fingers are not clenched and that your legs are relaxed too. And allow the sound of my voice to guide you through this journey. And now, it's time to explore. So how did it all begin? The oldest known ceramic artifacts are almost 30,000 years old, long before the first sedentary communities living on agriculture appeared. This corresponds to the late Paleolithic, and it is contemporary to the painting, the ornamentation of a lot of prehistoric caves. This tells us that ceramics were used before there were permanent villages with craftsmen practicing metallurgy, or more advanced forms of pottery with a wheel. The discovery that clay and other materials could be fired and transformed to become harder and acquire new properties is one of the first innovations of mankind. I'll tell you later about the various materials and the chemical reactions that happened during firing. The very first ceramic objects we know of were not plates, jars, or everyday containers. They were small figurines, shaped by hand and fired at several hundred degrees, probably in simple ovens. Rudimentary kilns dug into the ground. Some of the oldest known examples were discovered in Central Europe. Most famously, a small female statuette known as the Venus of Vestonice, found at a prehistoric settlement in what is now the Czech Republic. These early figurines may have carried religious or symbolic meaning, or perhaps they served as lucky charms. The people of the region also produced hundreds of small animal figures depicting the great creatures of the Ice Age by humans living in a world shaped by glaciers, harsh climates, and the great animals of the Pleistocene. Reproducing the image of these animals was likely charged with meaning, an act that mattered deeply to these communities. These objects were probably not simple toys or mere decoration, but part of a symbolic world in which early humans tried to understand, represent, and perhaps even influence the forces around them. The oldest ceramic objects we currently know of come from Central Europe, largely because exceptionally well-preserved prehistoric sites were discovered there. But it is very likely that the earliest experiments with clay and fire did not happen in just one place. Similar discoveries may have occurred independently in different parts of the world, or spread between communities, because 20 to 30,000 years ago, humans already had mastery over fire, and clay was abundant around many settlements. The knowledge that Earth could be shaped and transformed by heat may have emerged more than once, wherever people had the materials, the curiosity, and the time to experiment. Maybe prehistoric man just observed that earth or sand, round and under their fires, seemed to change appearance and texture after having been heated for a while, and they had the idea of trying this intentionally. We do not know exactly, but between these first figurines and the first examples of actual pottery, many generations passed, at least 10,000 years based on archaeological discoveries. But what is the difference between ceramic, pottery, terracotta, earthenware, and other terms like porcelain? It depends on the context. Technically, pottery is an object, often a vessel, but it can be a decorative object too, formed with ceramic material and fired at high temperatures to make it harder and more durable. So, in that sense, earthenware or porcelain are part of pottery, and they are also ceramic, which is a broad term that refers to any mineral material that has been fired to modify its properties. So, a brick or a floor tile, for example, is technically a ceramic, but it isn't usually described as pottery. Pottery refers to ceramic objects that exist as items in their own right: vessels, bowls, cups, figurines, things made to be used, held, or displayed. Bricks and tiles, by contrast, are ceramics designed as building materials, meant to become part of a larger structure rather than stand alone as individual objects. Now, that would be a general definition of pottery, because when it comes to archaeology, pottery in this context only means vessels, and this is how we understand pottery as long as it is about remains found on prehistoric or antique sites. In the same context, figurines are more often called terracottas, which literally means baked earth. It's the same material, same firing process. This is just a distinction based on destination that archaeologists make. And then another important distinction is between earthenware, stoneware, or porcelain, which are different types of clay-based pottery. Porcelain is a type of ceramic that was invented in China long after the two others. We'll come back to this extensively later. And it had revolutionary properties at the time. Porcelain is like the most advanced and technical material when it comes to pottery vessels. It requires very specific clay material and a high firing temperature. Before it, there was earthenware and stoneware. Earthenware was probably the oldest type of pottery. It is fired below 1200 degrees Celsius. That's 2400 Fahrenheit. It is also sometimes called terracotta, and it is non-vitreous, meaning that it absorbs liquids such as water. It is still very present in our homes, except it generally doesn't absorb water because it is coated with a ceramic glaze. The pieces made are waterproof, but not thanks to the ceramic material itself. It is thanks to the coating that is applied to it before firing. Then stoneware appeared, which is a broad category for pottery fired at higher temperatures and with a more specific formula. The main difference with earthenware is that due to the higher temperatures and the different material, stoneware is non-porous, and it is often vitrified, that is to say, turned into a sort of glass. This basically means that contrary to earthenware, it does not absorb liquids. This was an interesting property that made stoneware successful for utilitarian wares and higher quality products. And here again, China was a precursor. The first stoneware artifacts appeared either in India, in the Indus Valley, or in China. But in China and also in Japan, they became rather abundant. Stoneware began to be produced in Europe much later, during the Middle Ages. And then came porcelain, another Chinese invention that the Europeans were eager to imitate until they broke the code and found the formula in the 18th century. So that was just a quick tangent about definitions. Now let's go back to history. So, as I mentioned, the first examples of pottery in the sense of vessels appeared about 20,000 years ago, and the earliest fragments were found in China. It is believed that from China, the use of pottery spread to Japan and the Russian Far East, because shards of ceramic artifacts were found in these regions, and they date from the following millennia. Did it then spread to the rest of the world, or was it invented in multiple places? We don't know exactly, but during the Neolithic, the making of pottery vessels was present on all continents. There are traces in Europe and in Africa, south of the Sahara, in the 10th millennium BC, and slightly later in America. Everywhere around the world, pottery became relatively common. 10,000 years ago, it was cheap to produce, at least in comparison with precious artifacts. And it is probably the first types of wares that were made in larger facilities. We are not talking about industrialization yet, but as early as antiquity, there were production centers that rationalized its production, divided tasks, and produced vessels not only for local consumption, but for an entire region, or sometimes for trade. This appeared in China, in India, in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, and South America. And it is quite unique because it seems the same didn't happen on such a scale for other products, like textiles, for example. For thousands of years, objects were formed either manually or maybe using molds until the wheel was invented. It is believed that the wheel was invented first in Mesopotamia, and together with the first wheeled vehicles, the first potter's wheels appeared somewhere in Mesopotamia in the 5th millennium BC. And this helped to create curved pottery that was smoother, more regular, and probably much faster to produce, which made potters more productive. Another important aspect is that pottery was decorated. Very early on, ceramic vessels became supports for decoration and artistic expression, carrying patterns, symbols, and sometimes stories that went far beyond their practical use. This brings a wealth of information about antique civilizations. Fragments of pottery can be dated using carbon dating, which helps a lot to know not only when they were made, but what period an entire layer or an archaeological site belonged to. Their decoration also tells us of the tools that were used, the styles, the techniques. They reveal a lot more than the fragments themselves. And pottery was also traded. So it tells us of the connections between cultures that could sometimes live thousands of miles apart. For example, an early people that spread across much of Europe is named after its use of pottery, the corded ware culture. They are called corded ware culture because they had a specific way of decorating their pottery. They wrapped it with rope while it was still wet, so this left a decorative pattern. And then they fired their pottery. The rope burned off and the patterns imprinted the ceramic. The corded ware culture spread across Europe about 5,000 years ago in the late Neolithic, and it ended in the early Bronze Age several centuries later. But the extent of its presence and the period could entirely be mapped thanks to the dating and specific aspects of their pottery. The use of pottery vessels spread widely during the Neolithic period, and so did architectural ceramics, tiles, and even more so bricks, especially in regions where wood was scarce for construction, such as Egypt. Bricks were widely used for buildings. Stone was too expensive and slow to use for building, so it was reserved for tombs like pyramids or for temples, which are the Egyptian monuments that have crossed the centuries. But ancient Egypt was essentially built with bricks, often just dried in the sun. So in that sense, they were not really ceramics until they realized that bricks could become much harder and durable if fired in a kiln. So what is a kiln exactly? It is a term for a type of oven, a chamber that is thermally insulated. It can concentrate heat and can be used for the firing of ceramics because it reaches these temperatures that are much higher than the one the basic oven for cooking could ever reach. The ancient version, at least at the start, was quite rudimentary. They basically just were holes dug in the ground. But across the centuries, kilns were perfected and they became more and more efficient, reaching peaks of temperature in ancient China and to a lesser extent in Greece and the Roman Empire. So speaking of this, let's take a look at the art of pottery in various ancient civilizations, starting with Egypt, because it's always interesting to speak about ancient Egypt. We know about how Egyptians made pottery mainly from depictions on the walls of tombs and temples along the many centuries of Egyptian history. More techniques to form vessels and other objects appeared, but they all remained in use until the end. At first, ceramic objects were shaped entirely by hand, but hand building had its limits. The walls of these early vessels tended to be quite thick, and it was difficult to make large pieces from wet clay. Before firing, the material is heavy and fragile, and taller or wider forms can collapse under their own weight. Over time, these practical limits pushed potters to invent new techniques, new ways of shaping clay that made lighter, larger, and more regular forms possible. One that was used for large items such as tubs was to make flat and relatively thin rectangular pieces of wet clay and then weave them together before firing. This is recognizable on archaeological sites because when broken, these items tend to form rectangular shards. They broke where they were the weakest. The potter's wheel was introduced in the 3rd millennium BC, either copied from Mesopotamia or reinvented locally. The first potter's wheels were slow. The potter would make them turn with one hand and form objects with the other hand. As I mentioned before, It not only facilitated the making of symmetrical and almost perfectly curved objects, but it was also much faster, and pottery could be somewhat standardized thanks to them. So, like in other cultures, it came with a kind of mass production. Egyptians also used molds, especially to make the bread pans, in which small conical breads were baked. These molds were probably just a cone of wood shaped like these breads, and they added clay around it before letting it dry and then firing the pottery. Later in the second millennium BC, during the New Kingdom, the last period of Egyptian unity and independence in antiquity, before the country was invaded multiple times. So during the New Kingdom, faster potter wheels were introduced. They were no longer put in motion by hand, but by the potter's feet. This made the forming of vessels even more productive. So in Egypt, pottery was widespread and part of everyone's life. Even poor people had cups, bowls, and plates, and often figurines of small animals and gods. Before the clay had fully dried, simple decoration was often added, even on inexpensive everyday pieces. A few incised lines, small impressions made with stamps, or basic patterns were enough to give each object a distinct identity. The piece was then left to dry thoroughly before it could be fired. Like others, the Egyptians had discovered that the pieces needed to lose almost all their water before firing, because if they didn't, water did not just evaporate in the kiln. Some of it stayed trapped inside the walls of the items, so it boiled, and it could even make the piece explode. So they always needed to be already dry before firing. The Egyptians had figured out that they could change the aspect of their pottery during firing too. They realized that if they allowed a good supply of air enter the kiln, the resulting pottery could take a red to brown color. It is because there is iron in clay, so when oxygen is abundant during firing, they tend to combine and form iron 3 oxide, also known as rust. Whereas when they rationed air and oxygen, pottery took a gray to black color, because with less oxygen available, iron 2 oxide formed instead. They didn't know how that worked chemically, but they used this process to vary their decoration and their colors. And they also discovered more and more oxides that were introduced for more colors: blue, yellow, white. There were fashions in the decorative patterns. Not really fashions in the modern sense, because they typically lasted for several generations, not years like nowadays. But most Egyptian pottery, especially luxury pieces, can be approximately dated by experts just by looking at the patterns. Heads of gods, like the goddess Hathor or Bes, a god that protected houses, lotus flowers, papyrus, grapes. Some of the pieces were found intact in tombs after thousands of years, and they are a testimony of the refinement that the Egyptians were capable of. They are exquisite and require the sum of different materials and know-how that could only be accumulated after centuries of trial and error. We know that the pottery in Egypt had turned to an industrial activity in the sense that there were large workshops, and in various sites, the remains of multiple kilns were found. This indicates that production went on constantly, and most of it was to be sold. But the status and the economic importance of pottery is less known. There is another civilization in which pottery had a major importance economically, and it is ancient Greece. There is an international research project about ancient ceramics that lists all known items. It is called the Corpus Vasarum Antiquorum, the corpus of ancient vases. Yes, it's a thing. It contains records of over 100,000 Greek painted vases. And when you think that most of the pottery produced in Greece was probably lost, it gives you an idea of the millions and millions of pieces of Greek pottery that were made. The Greeks produced everyday pottery for kitchen use, of course, but they also developed a production of fine pottery, of luxury goods that they exported all around the Mediterranean Sea. Not all of it was produced in Greece. Greek colonies also participated, such as in the south of Italy. The Greeks invented or used shapes that we associate with their culture. For example, the amphora. It is a type of container with a pointed bottom, and they could fit tightly against each other, which made them perfect for transport by boat. This reduced the risk of losing cargo because once they were positioned inside the ship and tied together with rope, they wouldn't move. They were used in vast numbers to transport not just liquid like wine, but dry products too. And most of them were ceramics. Even though there are a few examples of amphoras made of metal at the same time, pottery was much cheaper and accessible than copper, bronze, or later iron, of course. Another Greek container was the pithos, a large storage container that was used for bulk storage. This one could stand on its own on its base. More than other cultures, they also made vessels with a specific purpose. For example, for mixing the crater, the large vase made to mix water and wine. The practice of drinking pure wine was very uncommon in antiquity. It was almost always diluted with water. The Greeks had different kinds of cups depending on the liquid they would receive. The most common type of wine drinking cup is called a kylix. A kylix had a broad body raised on a stem from a foot, and usually there were two handles on either side. An alternative was the cantharus, which was narrower and higher with vertical handles. They also had more types of vases for oils, for cosmetics, and perfumes. They made vases designed to serve as grave markers. And these are just a few examples of the extraordinary variety of Greek pottery. What Greek pottery is also famous for is the ambitious, figurative painting on it. In the first centuries, when Greek culture emerged, the decoration of pottery was dominated by geometric patterns and a lot of circular and wavy patterns too. There were a few figurative elements, probably inspired by Crete, where the Minoan civilization was flourishing at the time, but not that many. The practice to depict characters and scenes on pottery really took off and dominated from the 7th to the 3rd centuries BC, and the production of vases was dominated at the time by Athens. You know that ancient Greece was not a single state, at least not until it was unified later by Alexander the Great. It was a cultural area with a collection of small states, and the city-state of Athens was one of the most important. Athens invented the so-called red figure technique, that is to say, a black background with characters painted in shades of yellow to red. Before, characters were typically painted in black on a red background, and in production centers, vases and other vessels became a support of choice for artistic expression. In a sense, similar to painting on a canvas in modern painting. And the Greeks also developed a white ground technique later, by the end of the 6th century BC. Black figures and red figures were obtained through the application and firing of thin layers of slips. Slips are mixtures of minerals diluted in water. These colors were not applied on vases after firing. They were part of the vase itself. The white ground technique involved Greek potters first coating the surface of a vase with a fine white slip, a liquid clay that dries pale. Artists then drew figures on this white surface, usually in outline, and added color with mineral pigments. And it was a valuable innovation because it allowed for more colors on vases. It is this mix of technical innovations and artistic value that made the Greeks dominate this trade in the Mediterranean. Their clients also knew pottery, of course, and produced their own vessels, but they just couldn't do what the Greeks were able to do in terms of technical achievement and style. And production in Athens or other cities was a true industry. Perhaps the first example of an industry for consumer goods, because their production of other goods like textiles or furniture was much more decentralized, whereas pottery was mass-produced to meet strong demand for elaborate luxury goods or for transport of food and beverages all around the Mediterranean Sea. As the Egyptians, and later the Greeks, were developing their pottery, so were pre-Columbian cultures in America. And this was also remarkable. The earliest known ceramics from the Americas were found in Brazil, in the north near the city of Santarém, on the Amazon River. And they have been dated between 8,000 and 7,000 years ago. They were produced by a culture of fishermen and shellfish gatherers that is otherwise little known. Between 7,000 and 5,000 years ago, ceramics appeared all across North, Central, and South America. It is unclear whether the migrations that came from Asia brought ceramic, or if it was reinvented locally in the Americas. Maybe both happened, but in any case, pottery was present several thousand years ago, from the Arctic region to the south of the continent. These cultures were often in contact with each other, but their geographical knowledge was limited to their region and its surroundings. So many different traditions formed, and pottery could look very different. In North America, the Mississippian culture that existed in the American Midwest and Southwest in the 2nd and 3rd millennium BC used to temper clay with ground shell. Tempering is the practice of mixing clay with other materials. It could be ash, charcoal, sand, bone, or in this case, shell. The reason for tempering clay is that it avoids shrinkage or cracking during drying and firing of vessels. Pretty much every culture discovered this, and they developed their particular formulas. There were several other major ceramic traditions in what became the United States. The ancestral Puebloans from the Southwest is another one, and the shapes and decorative patterns are all very different. But if we consider the Americas as a whole, an element that comes back more often than in any other parts of the world is the production of sculptures to make ceramic objects, especially human heads or faces. They all produced vessels and all the containers they needed, but there was also a rich tradition of creating figurines, sometimes quite large, and decorating objects like urns, musical instruments, and even household pottery with sculpture. Ceramic was a form of artistic expression that still exists today, of course, but it has lost the kind of preeminence it used to have in these cultures. When we think about fine arts today, we are probably more inclined to think about painting or sculpture. This is a reminder that the forms of art and expression are not set in stone. It is well possible that in a few centuries, people will be surprised that Western artists of the 16th to the 21st centuries were so obsessed with painting on canvases. Let's go on, because we still have more regions in the world to visit. And before we talk about China, let's make another stop in the medieval Islamic world, because it also developed an aesthetic that mixed influences from the Mediterranean world and Asia. And more than any other cultural area, they used ceramic to decorate buildings with tiles. When the expansion of Islam began in the 7th century, they inherited various ancient pottery industries in Mesopotamia, in Persia, in Egypt, and North Africa, and with them, centuries-old techniques and styles. This knowledge circulated within the Islamic world for several centuries, and it was also in contact with China, which was very influential because it was not just the most advanced part of the world when it came to ceramics. We'll get to this in a minute. The Chinese had also created a variety of styles, of shapes, and colors that were very appealing to foreigners. Starting with all these influences and the circulation of techniques, Islamic potters soon developed their own innovations. In the 9th century, they started producing stoneware. You remember the difference between earthenware and stoneware? It is the earthenware is porous. It is fired at lower temperatures and it needs to be coated to become waterproof, whereas stoneware is vitreous and non-porous, but harder to make because it requires mixing ingredients precisely and also higher firing temperatures. In Persia, lusterware was developed. These are a type of pottery with a metallic glaze that makes them iridescent. Another thing that the Islamic world would prove very good at developing was tin glazed pottery, also known as faience, which is earthenware covered in lead glaze with added tin oxide. This gives it a white and shiny appearance. Faience was a huge success in Europe. It was imitated in Spain, in Italy, in France, and in Northern Europe. It is still produced. Historically, faience industries developed in several European cities. An important one was Delft in the Netherlands, which developed a distinctive white and blue style until the 18th century. This was the best Europeans could do. They knew of Chinese porcelain because pieces arrived, brought by traders or as diplomatic gifts, and they couldn't help but notice that faience looked like the poor man's porcelain because it is typically much thicker. Earthenware needs a minimal thickness to stay in one piece, and there is coating on both sides. So in comparison with porcelain vessels, it looks more rustic, and it can be very white and shiny, but it doesn't have the translucent properties of porcelain. I'll tell you more about that when we speak of China. Returning to the Muslim world, another tradition in Islamic art and architecture that is still very visible today in Muslim countries and that started in the 9th century was to decorate the inside and outside of buildings with brightly colored tiling, generally arranged in geometric patterns. This was probably inspired by Byzantine mosaics at the start. The first examples were made like mosaics with many small tiles of one color that were cut and arranged to create patterns. Then later, with a better knowledge of firing and oxides to obtain colors, they started to make entire panels that were painted before firing, which is a much faster way of covering surfaces. The very intricate patterns on the domes and the walls, typically geometric patterns or text or flowers or foliage, are painted before firing, and once they are turned into ceramic, they provide at the same time ornamentation and protection because they are waterproof and very durable. Our tour would not be complete without a stop in China, because since ceramic appeared, China has been the place where most innovations have taken place, and its tradition is so rich and ancient that entire encyclopedias could be written about it. I mentioned at the beginning that the very first known potteries appeared in China almost 20,000 years ago, during the Paleolithic era. The Chinese invented stoneware centuries before anyone else, as far as we know. They mastered the art of making porcelain nearly 2,000 years before Europeans, who only much later succeeded in producing true porcelain outside of China. The Chinese also used ceramic as building material for thousands of years, bricks and tiles. And when it comes to production and trade, they dominated the world market as soon as trade connections were established in antiquity. They produced on an industrial scale that served everyone, from the popular Chinese markets for kitchenware to a more discriminating Chinese market, all along the centuries. Wealthier people had a knowledge and interest in ceramics in China. It was a sought-after luxury or upscale type of good. It was collected and used as decoration centuries before the same trend began in Europe, and up to the court of emperors who had access to the finest porcelain. So, what made China so advanced in this field? Probably a combination of interest in ceramics that made the Chinese invest a lot in experimenting techniques, the internal competition between artisans and dynasties, and the interest of emperors, and the taste of the elite for luxury goods. The same could probably be said of silk, for example, and thanks to all this, there were a few technological breakthroughs. The Chinese made kilns that could reach higher temperatures thanks to better insulation and ventilation. Making stoneware and porcelain requires temperatures above 1200 degrees Celsius, and these were reached in China in the first millennium BC, long before other parts of the world, as far as we know. And more than in other cultures, they worked on mixing clays with all sorts of ingredients. This is probably how porcelain was invented, as one of many experiments. The one key ingredient in it is kaolin, which is a clay mineral that comprises aluminum and silicon. This is quite specific, and there can be other ingredients necessary like quartz, and it must be fired at high temperature. And porcelain obtains its properties, the hardness, translucence, from a process of vitrification. Porcelain is not glass, though. Even though technically glass could be considered a kind of ceramic, it is a raw material. In the case of glass, a mix of sand, soda, and potash is transformed chemically by firing. But glass is generally not considered to be a type of ceramic because the ingredients are very different and the production process is also very different. Typically, ceramics are formed and then they are fired. Glass is heated first to obtain a hot paste, and only after that are objects formed with the paste. Glass can also be melted again and transformed. It won't return to its original ingredients, but it can be recycled and made liquid again. Not ceramics. They can only be broken. Technically, it would not be impossible to liquefy ceramics at extremely high temperatures and do something else with the paste obtained, but this is too complicated and not worth it. So contrary to glass, it is not recycled at all into new objects. The exact date when the fabrication process of porcelain was invented is unclear, because there were intermediate stages in the elaboration of the formula. The first proto-porcelain that was vitrified, hard and white, appeared during the Han Dynasty in the first 3 centuries of our era. I made a story about the Great Wall and the history of ancient China. If you want to know more about the context, you can find it in my library. And by the 7th century AD, the formula had been perfected and stabilized with production on an industrial scale. Porcelain was a huge success early on, and demand was very strong. To give you an idea of the scale of this production, the Chinese had developed long kilns that could be up to 60 meters long. That's about 200 feet. They are called dragon kilns, and kilns had a fairly steep slope. Hence the name probably, that they let hot air circulate inside. Up to 25,000 pieces could be fired at once inside these kilns. The industry spread to Japan, But the Chinese protected their fabrication secrets because they generated a considerable income and prestige from them. Chinese porcelain began to flow into Europe in the 6th century, brought by Portuguese and then Dutch traders, and a technology race between faience makers to try to imitate it, especially the white and blue design that remains associated with Chinese porcelain, because at the time, under the Ming Dynasty, it was popular there in China. In the process, various processes were invented that are not the real thing, but still represented innovations, and they are still produced today, like bone china, which was invented in England trying to replicate the Chinese formula. It contains bone ash, which is what you get when you calcinate animal bones. As the name says, it contains calcium oxide and phosphorus, and it looked better than the thick faience that was produced at the time, but it didn't have the transparency and the hardness of real porcelain. Another example was soft paste porcelain. It is called soft paste because it lacks hardness, so it could be stretched rather easily. And there were many formulas for it, but they didn't come close to the Chinese one because there was no kaolin. Finally, at the beginning of the 18th century, the code was cracked in Meissen, Germany, and later in other European countries, and a European porcelain industry took off along the 18th century with success. But still, the Chinese maintained a huge production and remained the maker of porcelain, especially the city of Qingdezhen. This is where the porcelain industry was concentrated at the time of the Ming Dynasty. Ceramic palaces and homes for decorative purposes probably reached its peak in the 18th and 19th centuries, but it is still very present in everyday life. I'm sure if you start paying attention to it in your home, you will be surprised at how many items you own in your cupboards. Plates, mugs, bowls, cups, and possibly all around the house, lamps, vases, and other decorative objects. It is a different story, but in the 20th century, industrial ceramics started to be used for their properties like hardness, stability, and resistance to high temperatures, so they can be found in all sorts of devices and facilities, from semiconductors to cooktops to nuclear plants. We have reached the end of tonight's story. There would be much more to say about ceramics, but you know where to find documentaries or books, and you can also pay a visit and support local artisans who keep this tradition alive. The sum of technique, know-how, and talent that can be behind simple objects that we see every day can be impressive. And by paying attention to this, you train yourself to go beyond appearances and realize how rich and interesting our environment can be. It is easy to see things without looking at them, looking into them, and in the process ignore all the depth and substance they are enclosed. So, it can be ceramic and it can be other things, but start looking at them more closely and ask yourself questions about these little things around you. When did mankind start to wear clothes? long before textiles were invented. In fact, research indicates that humans may have begun wearing clothing as far back as 100,000 to 500,000 years ago. Probably animal fur and skin, possibly clothing made of leaves or other plant material. We don't exactly know. The most ancient sewing needles that have been discovered have been dated to at least 50,000 years ago. And we're going to see that textiles appeared tens of thousands of years later, from 20,000 to 30,000 years ago. We have figurines found in Europe that depict clothing pieces. There are skirts made of twisted fibers, hats or caps, belts. Archaeologists also found various artifacts used in textile making, like weaving sticks. The oldest of them have been dated to more than 7,000 years ago. It is unclear exactly when the transition to actual textile happened, as opposed to skin sewn together, that is. But the first type of textile was probably felt. Felt is not a woven fabric. It is obtained by matting and pressing natural fibers together. The ancient process only works with animal hairs. Hot water is applied to 2 layers of animal hairs, and then when the fabrics are agitated and compressed, they hook together into a single piece of fabric. It doesn't work well with vegetable fibers because they don't have this property to curl and form a single piece when they are soaked in hot water and pressed. This technique probably appeared in Central Asia, and it is still used by nomadic tribes to make clothing, boots, or rugs. It is a very useful material because it is water repellent, doesn't burn easily, and absorbs sounds. Actually, even though it is not a very common type of textile, you may own some. It is used to cover pool tables, bridge tables, game tables in casinos, or as a damper in many musical instruments like pianos. About 8,000 years ago, woven textiles appeared around the world, and evidence of their presence can be found on every continent, at least in regions that were dry enough to preserve them. This includes the Middle East, China, India, North Africa, and dry parts of America, especially Peru. It is less certain when textiles were first made in the regions around the equator or the tropics, because all textiles are relatively fragile, and they survive thousands of years only in the driest regions. However, it is likely that they spread all around the world during the Neolithic period. We know that this period was rich in migrations that propagated innovations at a very slow pace compared with our modern standards. It took centuries or thousands of years, but this is still not that much relative to mankind's history. It seems the first fibers used in woven textiles were botanical, and the first one was flax, also known as linen. Long before cotton, flax was cultivated at least 8,000 years ago in the Middle East. It is a crop that serves for food. The seeds are edible and give linseed oil. And the stem gives fibers that are very strong, stronger than cotton and relatively smooth. From the Near East, the cultivation of flax spread to Europe India, and China, where it was present about 5,000 years ago. Flax was cultivated extensively in ancient Egypt, for example, where it was used for clothing, sails, and to bury people as a shroud or to wrap mummies. In the entire Mediterranean world and in Europe, people relied mainly on linen for plant-based textiles. They also used a lot of wool. We'll talk about that later. But at the time, cotton was very rare in this part of the world. The Phoenicians traded Egyptian linen throughout the Mediterranean. The Romans adopted it, and several centuries later, in the European Middle Ages, it was still a very important fiber. In Europe, the industry was centered on Flanders. The crop was cultivated in Northern Europe and then processed and turned into cloth, including dyed cloth, around Flanders and exported via medieval trade routes. If you are interested in how dyes were produced and how the taste and color moved in this period, I made a story called The History of Colors. You can find it in my library. Linen dominated vegetable fibers in the West until the 18th century, when cotton replaced it. At first, cotton and cotton fabrics mainly came from India. But as cotton products grew in popularity, Europeans took control of this industry. Cotton was introduced to their colonies in America as a good cash crop. They imported the raw material from America and India and produced textiles in a region centered on England and the north of France. We will return to the history of cotton a bit further down the road. There were several steps involved in the production of textiles, whether with linen, cotton, or wool. They haven't changed that much, even though they have been industrialized. And they are still practiced to make fabric with natural fibers. First, the raw material must be prepared. Fibers are washed in a first cleaning phase. Then comes carding and combing, which are methods to disentangle and straighten out fibers. Once the raw material has been prepared, it is turned into thread or yarn by spinning. Spinning is the action of pulling and twisting the fibers. It could be done manually with a sort of spike. This is probably how it began during antiquity or the Middle Ages. It is a bit unclear. The spinning wheel was introduced first in India and the Islamic world. From there, it reached Europe and became widely used. The spinning wheel increased productivity and helped produce regular yarn. It was fundamental in the textile industry prior to the Industrial Revolution, when it was replaced with other machines. After spinning, the yarn had to be woven, which was done on the loom. Threads were arranged vertically as a warp, either from the top or the loom when it was vertical, or from one side. The weaver then passed the horizontal thread, known as the weft, through the vertical threads using a shuttle. To ensure that the fabric remained tight, the weft thread was pushed every time it passed through the warp. After hours, days or even weeks of work, a piece of cloth was obtained. However, there were finishing stages for woolen cloth. The first was fulling, which involved soaking the cloth in water and then beating it to tighten the threads. Then came dyeing and eventually printing. Printing and dyeing were the significant advantages of cotton because this fiber works very well with color. Cotton fabrics largely replaced linen for the most part in the West, but cotton also has its own ancient history. In the ancient world, cotton was produced and used in two main centers, India and America. The oldest known cotton fabric, dating back 8,000 years, was found in Peru, indicating that this is where the plant was first domesticated. Cotton textiles also existed in North America, with evidence of cultivation 5,000 years ago in Mexico and Arizona by pre-Columbian Native American peoples. The other historical region of origin of cotton, where it was likely domesticated independently from the Americas, was India. The Greeks and later the Romans were aware of cotton, considering it an important luxury item that arrived through ancient trade routes like the Silk Road. They desired cotton for its smoothness and lightness, considering it superior to wool or linen. Cotton had the ability to retain vibrant colors, unlike wool, and the only fabric considered even better was silk, which was also an important luxury. Egypt had some cotton cultivation in antiquity, but it never became prominent or replaced linen and wool. Cotton became slightly more common in Europe during the Middle Ages, although it remained relatively rare. It was introduced to Spain and Sicily through the Muslim conquest in the south of Italy. These regions were later recaptured, leading to the development of cotton manufacturing in the north of Italy and Flanders. The raw material was brought through Venice, as it was one of the products Venetian traders acquired during their travels to the Near East. They also imported a significant amount of ready-to-sell Indian fabrics that had passed through Persia and other parts of the Middle East. During that time, the fine Indian fabrics were considered superior to anything produced by the European industry, and this dominance persisted until the 18th century. India exported textiles to China, the Muslim world, and Europe, although it took some time for Europeans to realize their origin. One particular type of cotton fabric, muslin, it was named after the city of Mosul in Iraq, where Europeans believed it originated. However, it actually passed through Iraq and came from various production centers in India. The largest production center was located in the eastern part of India, specifically Bengal, around the city of Dhaka, which is now the capital of Bangladesh. However, there were several other production centers in India as well. In the 16th to 18th centuries, the rulers of India actively promoted the production of cotton and cotton textiles, leading to significant growth in the industry until the 18th century. Chinese and Muslim traders were attracted by Portuguese, Dutch, English, and French buyers who sailed to India via the southern route around Africa and gradually gained control over the trade in Asia. It is estimated that in the 18th century, Indian textiles were the most important manufactured goods in global trade. These textiles could be found from America to Japan, posing a challenge for European trading nations who had little to offer in return. India was largely self-sufficient, and there was low demand for European products. As a result, European countries had to export significant quantities of precious metals, such as gold and silver, to pay for Indian products. This circumstance prompted European countries to make efforts to develop their own cotton industry. During this period, there was an increasing import of raw materials and the development of the printing industry with new patterns. An example of such a pattern is toile de Juillet, which emerged in the 18th century. Toile de Juillet consists of a repeated pattern on a plain background, often white with the pattern itself in color. Traditionally, these patterns depicted pastoral themes or arrangements of flowers. Although originating in Ireland, they gained immense popularity in France and the United Kingdom in the 18th century, leading to exponential growth in production in these two countries. Toile de Juillet patterns were commonly used to cover furniture, walls, or curtains. The name Toile de Juillet refers to the cotton from Juillet, a city near Paris. The increasing demand for cotton led to the development of cotton cultivation in colonies, particularly in the West Indies, where the plant was already present before the arrival of Europeans, similar to other colonial crops such as sugarcane, coffee, or tobacco. The establishment of plantations and the widespread cultivation of cotton made it one of the main colonial products in the 18th century. However, this had significant and far-reaching consequences in other parts of the world. Most notably, it further stimulated the demand for African slaves. While the practice had begun earlier, cotton alone was responsible for the deportation of hundreds of thousands, potentially even millions, of African people to the Caribbean and later to the United States. In the years following independence, the United States was not a significant producer of cotton. In fact, it was quite marginal. However, in the 19th century, cotton production in the U.S. witnessed a dramatic and rapid growth. By the middle of the 19th century, states such as Georgia, Missouri, Louisiana, and Alabama were major cotton producers, despite having relatively small populations. A notable aspect of this population was that the 50% of it consisted of enslaved individuals, many of whom were born in America, but whose parents had been brought to the country 1 to 2 generations earlier. Another consequence of Europeans and later Americans assuming control over the cotton industry was the decline of India's textile industry. While it was not completely ruined, European production became cheaper and caught up in terms of quality, thereby accelerating the Industrial Revolution in Europe. The United States emerged as a significant provider of raw cotton and displaced India as a primary exporter of this commodity. The UK and France were the two main clients of American cotton. During the Civil War, the Confederacy attempted to coerce these two countries into intervening against the North by imposing an embargo on cotton. This strategy, known as cotton diplomacy, ultimately proved ineffective. However, the fact that such a measure was tried demonstrates the critical importance of the cotton supply to the textiles industry of these countries during that time. Silk is an ancient textile fiber that originated in China during the Neolithic period and has a history of approximately 6,000 years. Initially, silk production remained confined to China for several millennia until the opening of the Silk Road in the centuries BC. Even after the Silk Road facilitated the spread of silk products to regions like the Near East, India, and the Mediterranean, China maintained a monopoly on silk production for another 1,000 years because the knowledge of silk production remained exclusive to China. While silk is commonly thought as a luxury textile today, known for its fine quality and high value, it was more widely used and accessible several centuries ago. However, the mainstream popularity of silk declined as the price of cotton dropped and synthetic fibers like nylon emerged as cheaper alternatives. Silk is produced by the silk moth, specifically during its caterpillar stage, when it forms a cocoon made of a thin yet strong thread. This delicate and shimmering thread allows for the weaving of lightweight and lustrous textiles. According to a legendary tradition in China, the origin of silk is attributed to an accidental discovery. It is said that a silkworm cocoon fell into the teacup of an empress. As she attempted to retrieve the cocoon, the thread started unraveling. Intrigued, she came up with the idea of weaving the thread and was amazed by the resulting textile. The empress then observed the life cycle of the silkworm and proceeded to instruct others in the art of raising them, a practice known as sericulture. The knowledge of silk production was closely guarded in China, and it wasn't until the middle of the first millennium AD that silk started to be exported. However, its true origin remained a mystery to outsiders. The Romans, for example, were confused about it. While they knew that silk came from silkworms, they believed that the caterpillars directly wove the cloth on trees, similar to how spiders create their webs. Silk created a significant frenzy in early Chinese high society due to its qualities of lightness, shimmering appearance, and apparent perfection. This led to a restriction on silk usage, which lasted for approximately a millennium. Only members of the imperial family and a select few individuals of high rank were granted the privilege of wearing silk as a symbol of distinction. Certain types of silk possess a greater sheen than others, and this attribute is a result of the structure of the threads. The prism-like shape of these threads cause the light to refract from every single angle, creating the shimmering appearance. Over the course of centuries, the privilege of wearing silk was gradually extended to a wider circle of people, but it still remained prohibited for the masses. In fact, even touching silk was forbidden for peasants, who constituted the vast majority of the population. However, this prohibition was lifted under the Qing dynasty in the 17th century. Silk had applications beyond clothing and was also used in the creation of paper. Paper itself was another Chinese discovery and could be made from various raw materials such as bamboo, straw, linen, and even silk. During the 2nd century BC, under the Han Dynasty, silk paper production began, marking the emergence of the first luxury paper. Additionally, silk became more than just a material during this period. It functioned as a form of currency due to its high value. Silk could be used to pay high-ranking government officials, reward wealthy citizens, or serve as a tribute. The length of silk fabric became a monetary standard in China, comparable to the weight of gold. Silk had already reached other parts of the world even before the opening of the Silk Road, with regular trade routes established for the distribution of this prized product. Late ancient Egyptians, as well as the Greeks and Romans, had knowledge of silk even before opening the Silk Road in the 2nd century BC. Although small quantities of silk managed to leave China in earlier centuries, the Silk Road facilitated the availability of silk in much larger quantities. The fame and high prices of silk posed a threat to the Chinese monopoly over its production, prompting the Chinese to take measures to protect their control. An imperial decree was issued, condemning to death anyone attempting to export silkworms or their eggs. However, the Chinese monopoly over silk production was eventually broken. In 300 AD, the Japanese mounted an expedition that captured silkworm eggs and took young Chinese girls who were forced to teach them the art of sericulture. The Japanese refined their techniques over the ensuing centuries, leading to the widespread practice of sericulture in Japan on a larger scale. In the West, the first successful attempt to produce silk outside of China is believed to have taken place in the 6th century in the Byzantium Empire. Monks managed to smuggle silkworm eggs hidden in rods of bamboo, establishing a silk industry in Byzantium. The Arabs also contributed to the spread of silk production, introducing it across the shores of the Mediterranean, similar to their dissemination of cotton. The development of silk production outside of China did not lead to the demise of the Chinese silk industry, which had accumulated several thousand years of experience and continued to produce the highest quality silk fabrics in the subsequent centuries. However, the techniques of silk production eventually spread to the rest of Europe following the start of the Crusades in the Middle Ages. A new production center emerged in the north of Italy, which was further strengthened after the Fourth Crusade. This event resulted in the sack of Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, and the destruction of the silk industry in Byzantium. As a result, hundreds of skilled weavers relocated to Italy. The rise of the Ottoman Empire in the East had an impact on European access to imported silk, either reducing availability or making it more expensive. This gave a boost to Italian silk production, allowing it to prosper. The long tradition of fine textiles in northern Italy began in the Middle Ages and was made possible by the concentrated trading cities such as Venice and Genoa. These cities imported knowledge and new materials, benefiting from a well-populated area with wealthy patrons who formed a solid client base for luxury textiles and goods in general. By the 15th century, Chinese silk continued to make its way to Europe, but by this point, over half of the production had shifted to Europe, primarily in Italy. However, in the 16th century, the European center of silk production moved across the Alps to the city of Lyon in France. France faced a similar issue that the Italian city-states had experienced before, with a trade deficit resulting in a significant transfer of precious metals to Italy, caused by the importation of Indian and Chinese products through the Silk Road. To address this problem, kings attempted to develop a national silk industry. The country successfully established itself as a leading consumer of silk during that time. The combination of France's large population, a growing upper class with a willingness to spend on luxury goods, and the rise of fashion as a cultural phenomenon contributed to this achievement. It is important to note that for centuries, the demand for precious imported goods had primarily originated from a small group consisting of nobles and wealthy bourgeoisie. In the 16th century, the demand for luxury goods, driven particularly by royal courts across Europe, reached unprecedented levels. Prominent courts such as those of Henry VIII in England, Francis I in France, wealthy Italian city-states like Venice, Florence, and Rome, along with Madrid, witness courtiers and the high aristocracy spending more than ever on clothing and jewels. It was not uncommon for individuals in these circles to spend several times the income of an average person on a single outfit that would be worn only once. The high demand for luxury products led to the emergence of a luxury goods industry in Europe, with Italy and notably France playing significant roles. The strong and constantly changing fashion trends continuously renewed the demand for luxury goods. Consequently, Lyon became the new European capital of the silk trade in the 16th and 17th centuries. Lyon achieved this position by being granted a trade and manufacturing monopoly, and by successfully creating new patterns and styles that were used in high-end clothing, tapestries, and furniture. In the 17th century, the city of Lyon had over 10,000 looms dedicated to silk manufacturing, which supported approximately one-third of the city's population. This was a significant industry for pre-industrial times. However, with the onset of the Industrial Revolution in the late 18th century, the focus of textile innovation shifted primarily to the cotton industry, particularly in the United Kingdom. As I mentioned previously, cotton became a major commodity during this period, benefiting from productivity gains in spinning due to the new machines. Silk, on the other hand, remained somewhat on the sidelines. Being a thread already, silk did not benefit from the same advancements in spinning as cotton did. Furthermore, silk retained its status as a luxury product, while the price of cotton cloth was dropping, making it more accessible to larger markets. Weaving precious silk fabrics, which often incorporated silver or gold threads, involved a highly delicate process. It was done in small quantities and couldn't be fully industrialized. Thus, even though the Industrial Revolution, when textile production was undergoing significant changes, silk production remained more artisanal and limited in scale. During the Industrial Revolution, despite the emergence of giant factories and mass production in various industries, silk production remained semi-industrial. Innovations such as the jacquard loom, which used punched cards to automatically weave patterns, brought some advancements to silk weaving. This loom is notable as a precursor to the computers of the 1800s. The system of punch cards, although limited, served as an effective form of programming and continued to be used in computing until the 1970s. However, with the advent of the Industrial Revolution, European silk production began to decline and never fully recovered. Silk production was highly labor-intensive, and despite innovations and productivity gains, they couldn't fully compensate for the rising costs. Unlike the decreasing cost of raw cotton, the cost of silkworm cocoons continued to rise. Additionally, with the availability of cheaper and visually appealing cotton products, the demand for silk decreased significantly. In the 19th century, importing silk from China or Japan became more attractive due to the faster transportation enabled by the opening of the Suez Canal. As a result, silk production in Italy or Lyon became marginal. Today, silk production still exists, but is limited to producing high-end products or fabrics used in the restoration of antique objects, such as tapestries or silk-covered seats. As a counterintuitive outcome of the Industrial Revolution in Europe, China regained its position as the largest and most dominant producer of silk in the world. This status as the primary producer of silk continues to be held by China to this day. We are going to talk about one last very important type of fiber, wool. Wool has its own significant history in the realm of textiles, while felt, which is made of animal fibers pressed rather than woven, is recognized as the oldest known form of textile. Different animals produce various types of fibers despite their similar chemical compositions. Wool, distinct from hair or fur, grows from specialized cells called follicles in the skin. These follicles can produce fibers with different characteristics, including diameter, crimp, and elasticity, which can vary significantly. Wool, being finer than hair and fur, possesses a higher degree of crimp. For instance, a fine wool like merino can have up to 100 crimp waves per inch, whereas hair lacks crimp entirely. Spinning hair into yarn would be challenging since individual hair fibers do not easily attach to each other. In contrast, wool is easy to spin into yarn due to the presence of little crimps that help the fibers hold together. Wool exhibits a wide range of characteristics, including diameter, crimp, lipid content, natural color, and the percentage of fibers of different sizes within a fleece. Furthermore, wool can come from various animals, including sheep, goats, such as cashmere and mohair, rabbits, such as Angora, and camelids, including alpacas. The diversity of wool is attributed to the numerous variables involved, making it the most diverse type of natural fiber. It is also strongly associated with domestication, as wild wool was rare in nature before the domestication of the animals that produce it. The domestication of these species played a crucial role in the availability and development of wool as a textile fiber. Archaeological discoveries suggest that the selection of sheep for their wool began around 6000 BC, coinciding with the emergence of woven textiles. However, it is possible that the wool at that time was primarily used for felt or other purposes, as the oldest known wool garments date back 2,000 or 3,000 years later. The selective breeding of sheep for increased wool production and reduced hair transformed wool into a significant alternative to linen. During the time of the Roman Empire, the Mediterranean and European populations predominantly wore two types of materials, linen and wool. Cotton was still a curiosity, and silk was considered extravagant, so they were not commonly used by the majority of the population. Wool and linen complemented each other in various ways. Wool has the advantage of impeding heat transfer and serving as a good insulation material due to the bulkiness of wool fabrics resulting from their crimp. The air pockets created by the crimp contribute to thermal insulation. Linen, on the other hand, was better suited for warmer and drier climates, such as in Egypt and many parts of the Middle East. However, Even in hot climates, there were situations where the property of wool to keep the outside heat away was useful. Desert-dwelling people like the Bedouins in Arabia or the Tuareg in the Sahara utilized wool clothing for insulation. Different qualities of wool were used for various products, with the finest ones reserved for clothing and coarser ones used for blankets or rugs. Each region in the Middle East and Europe developed its own wool production, from raising sheep herds to manufacturing cloth. Similarly, in different parts of the world, local species of animals were domesticated for their wool. For example, in South America, alpacas and llamas were primarily used for their coats, while in India, various sheep breeds were utilized for wool production. During the Middle Ages, the wool trade played a significant role in European commerce, while a substantial portion of wool production was conducted locally for local consumption, particularly in remote areas. The 13th century witnessed the emergence of international trade and division of labor in the industry. The Low Countries, modern-day Belgium and the Netherlands, and Italy became the two main regions for weaving and trading. Raw wool materials were sourced from various regions in Western Europe, with England being the primary producer of raw wool, followed by Spain to a lesser extent. English wool remained the main export for centuries and played a critical role in the English economy, at least during the 17th century. Even after that, it continued to be protected. For instance, at the end of the 17th century, the English crown forbade American colonies from trading wool with anyone other than England. Furthermore, since a significant portion of the value of woolen textiles lay in the detailing and finishing, England attempted to develop its own manufacturing industry. In the 14th century, only about 10% of wool produced was transformed into textiles, but this percentage increased over the following centuries in regions where wool manufacturing and trade were significant. This industry had a major impact on economic development and the gradual emergence of capitalism. Towards the end of the Middle Ages, the wool trade became highly substantial, generating capital that could be reinvested. It also brought about changes in the organization of production in countries such as England, Italy, the Netherlands, Western Germany, and Northern France. A new class of bourgeois entrepreneurs emerged, taking control of the entire production process outside the authority of guilds or states. While there were no factories or complex machines during this period, which would come later, these entrepreneurs organized and oversaw the entire manufacturing process. They procured raw materials and provided employment to numerous individual workers or small workshops, effectively managing the various stages of production. In the cottage industry system, different individuals had distinct roles. Some spun wool into yarn, others wove it, and others dyed the textiles. The supervisors of this system purchased and provided all the necessary raw materials. paid the workers based on the pieces produced, and managed the logistics, including delivering materials and collecting the finished products. This system, known as the cottage industry in England, had a significant and long lasting impact in regions where it was practiced. The cottage industry uplifted standards of living and was generally well received by inhabitants of rural areas. It provided an additional source of income, especially during the winter when agricultural work was limited. Moreover, it allowed for the accumulation of capital that could be invested elsewhere. Even decades prior to the Renaissance in Italy, families like the Medici in Florence built their fortunes in the wool trade. They utilized their wealth to establish the first banks and invest in various sectors. When the Industrial Revolution commenced centuries later, it is no coincidence that it initially took place in Great Britain and later expanded into parts of continental Europe. While technical innovations such as machines and the availability of raw materials were crucial ingredients for the Industrial Revolution, it's important to note that the foundation of entrepreneurial capital and spirit had already emerged long before. This readiness to invest in manufacturing projects propelled by the pursuit of profitability played a pivotal role in the transformation that unfolded during the Industrial Revolution. The historical significance of textiles, particularly wool, should not be underestimated in shaping the economic world we inhabit today. Wool played a central role in the process of capital accumulation and the restructuring of production methods, transcending its significance as a textile material. In the 19th century, the production of wool, along with cotton and other raw materials, followed a similar trajectory. It became decentralized and relocated to colonies or other parts of the world. In the case of wool, this relocation primarily occurred in countries such as Australia, which remains the largest wool producer in the world, and New Zealand. Additionally, significant wool producing countries in modern times include China and the United States. This overview mainly encompassed natural fibers used in textiles for thousands of years, although there are more fibers like jute, which is derived from plants and used in textiles such as burlap. The ones mentioned have consistently held the greatest importance. While understanding the materials, techniques, and the impact of the textile industry on shaping the world is fascinating, there is another dimension to consider: style. Well, as usual, there would be many more things to tell you, but for now we've come to the end of our little journey tonight. I hope you enjoyed this adventure, and I invite you to discover and learn more. Now you can let go and sleep. Or, if you're not sleepy yet, you may pick another story from my ever-growing library. And until we meet again, good night. Sleep well.